Hello, my dear friends. In the medieval world, the idea of mental health did not exist in the way we understand it today. There were no psychiatrists, no therapy rooms, no clear language for anxiety, depression, trauma, or psychological disorders. Yet people still suffered in their minds just as deeply as they do now. Fear, grief, despair, confusion, obsession, and sorrow were all present in medieval life. The difference was not the experience of these struggles, but how they were interpreted. Medieval society understood the human mind through religion, medicine, and superstition rather than science. Emotional and psychological distress was rarely seen as a medical condition rooted in the brain. Instead, it was interpreted through spiritual frameworks. A person who heard voices might be believed to be touched by God or tormented by demons. A person who withdrew into silence might be described as melancholic, sinful, or possessed. What we now call mental illness was filtered through a worldview that blended faith, fear, and limited medical theory. One of the dominant explanations for emotional distress in medieval Europe was the theory of the four humors. According to this ancient medical belief, the body contained four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health depended on balance between them. If black bile was too dominant, a person was said to suffer from melancholy. Melancholy was not simply sadness. It was believed to produce deep gloom, irrational fear, sleeplessness, and strange behavior. Treatment focused on restoring balance through diet, herbs, bloodletting, or purging rather than conversation or reflection. At the same time, religious interpretation shaped everyday understanding. The church played a central role in defining what was normal and what was dangerous. Intense sadness might be described as spiritual despair. Anxiety could be interpreted as a lack of faith. Hallucinations might be labeled divine visions or demonic temptations depending on context. The line between illness and spirituality was thin and unstable. In monasteries, some forms of mental suffering were described carefully and even sympathetically. Monks wrote about a condition called acedia, often translated as spiritual laziness or despair. Acedia involved restlessness, hopelessness, lack of motivation, and emotional numbness. It sounds remarkably similar to modern descriptions of depression. Yet it was framed as a spiritual struggle rather than a medical one. The solution was prayer, discipline, and renewed devotion. Outside monasteries, those who displayed extreme or disruptive behavior faced harsher outcomes. Individuals who shouted in the streets, acted violently, or appeared detached from reality could be labeled mad. Madness was feared. It was unpredictable and poorly understood. Families often hid mentally ill relatives at home. If behavior became dangerous, confinement was common. Early hospitals and charitable institutions sometimes housed those considered insane, but conditions were basic and treatment minimal. Some medieval towns developed institutions specifically for the mentally ill, but they were not therapeutic spaces. They were places of containment. The goal was protection of the community, not recovery of the individual. People were restrained, isolated, or simply supervised. Compassion existed in some cases, but systematic care did not. It is important to understand that medieval life itself placed enormous strain on the mind. Constant exposure to death, war, famine, and disease created psychological pressure few modern people can imagine. The Black Death alone wiped out vast portions of Europe's population, leaving survivors traumatized and grieving without language to describe it. Chronic insecurity shaped daily existence. Trauma was common, yet invisible. Women faced additional complexity. Emotional expression in women was often dismissed as weakness or hysteria. Spiritual visions could elevate a woman to sainthood or condemn her as unstable, depending on who judged her. Accusations of witchcraft sometimes grew from misunderstood psychological conditions. Fear of female unpredictability mixed dangerously with religious suspicion. Children were not spared misunderstanding either. Developmental differences, learning challenges, or behavioral disorders had no clear framework. Some were labeled slow, cursed, or possessed. Education was limited, and understanding even more so. Despite these limitations, medieval communities were not entirely cruel. Families often cared for struggling members with patience. Monasteries sometimes offered refuge. Villages could show quiet tolerance toward eccentric individuals who were harmless. The absence of modern science did not mean the absence of humanity. It meant that understanding was shaped by the tools available at the time. What stands out most about mental health in medieval times is not that suffering existed, but that it was explained differently. Where we see illness, they often saw imbalance or spiritual conflict. Where we see trauma, they saw divine testing or punishment. These interpretations shaped responses for better and worse. The medieval mind lived inside a world where the supernatural felt close and real. This worldview gave meaning to suffering, but also limited solutions. Without neuroscience or psychology, relief depended on prayer, herbal medicine, routine, community, and sometimes restraint. And so mental health in the Middle Ages existed in a space between care and fear, belief and misunderstanding, compassion and control. As medieval society continued through centuries of uncertainty and upheaval, the understanding of the human mind remained deeply tied to religion and inherited medical theory. Emotional suffering was rarely separated from moral or spiritual meaning. If a person experienced overwhelming sadness, panic, or strange thoughts, the question asked was not, "What is happening inside the brain?" but rather, "What is happening inside the soul?" Priests were often the first people approached when someone showed signs of distress. Confession served as a form of emotional release. People described their fears, guilt, obsessive thoughts, or feelings of despair within a religious framework. The priest responded with guidance, prayer, penance, and reassurance. While this was not therapy in the modern sense, it sometimes provided comfort. It gave structure to chaos. It placed suffering within a story that made sense to the believer. For those whose symptoms were more severe, hearing voices, speaking incoherently, acting unpredictably, the response could shift dramatically. Demonic possession was a widely accepted explanation for unusual behavior. Exorcism rituals were performed with seriousness and ritual care. Holy water, prayer, relics, and chanting were used to drive out what was believed to be an external force. In some cases, the ritual may have calmed individuals who believed they were possessed. In other cases, it likely intensified fear. Medical practitioners, though limited in knowledge, did attempt treatments rooted in humor theory. If melancholy was diagnosed, physicians might recommend dietary changes, fresh air, music, or herbal remedies. Certain plants were believed to lighten the mood or calm agitation. Bloodletting was also common, intended to rebalance the body's fluids. Though ineffective by modern standards, these treatments show an attempt to apply logic and structure to emotional suffering. The medieval hospital was not what we imagine today. Early hospitals were charitable institutions connected to monasteries. They cared for the sick, poor, elderly, and sometimes the mentally ill together. Treatment focused on shelter, food, prayer, and basic care rather than medical intervention. In some cases, the mentally ill were treated gently. In others, they were restrained for safety. There was no unified approach because there was no unified understanding. Public reaction to mental illness varied widely. In small villages, someone with unusual behavior might simply be known as eccentric and allowed to live quietly on the edges of society. Communities were tight-knit. Everyone knew each other. If a person was not violent, tolerance was often possible. In larger cities, however, unpredictability felt more threatening. Urban life required order. Disruptive behavior was more likely to result in confinement. War also played a silent role in shaping medieval mental health. Soldiers returning from conflict often carried invisible wounds. Though there was no term for trauma as we use it now, accounts describe nightmares, agitation, and sudden bursts of emotion after battle. These reactions were not labeled as illness. They were seen as the cost of violence, sometimes interpreted as guilt or spiritual burden. Women's mental health was shaped heavily by gender expectations. Emotional intensity in women was often described as natural instability. Conditions that today might be recognized as postpartum depression, anxiety disorders, or hormonal mood shifts were framed as weakness, sin, or even moral failure. Herbal midwives sometimes offered remedies for distress after childbirth, but deeper psychological pain often went unrecognized. Monastic life provided a unique environment for reflection on mental struggle. Monks and nuns wrote honestly about inner battles, fear of damnation, obsessive thoughts about sin, emotional numbness, and spiritual emptiness. These writings reveal a surprisingly detailed awareness of internal conflict. Yet the solution was always spiritual discipline rather than medical intervention. The absence of scientific language did not erase suffering. It changed how it was named. Medieval people experienced panic, depression, psychosis, and grief just as humans always have. What differed was interpretation. Without neuroscience, every emotion had moral or spiritual weight. Every symptom carried meaning beyond itself. In this world, the mind was never isolated from the cosmos. Distress was connected to God, demons, humors, fate, and divine will. This framework could offer comfort, but it could also trap individuals in cycles of guilt and fear. Relief depended on belief, community, and sometimes luck. Mental health in medieval times was therefore not absent, but misunderstood. It existed quietly in confession booths, monastery cells, village homes, and early hospitals, shaped by faith, tradition, and limited knowledge, yet still profoundly human. As medieval centuries unfolded, the boundaries between mental illness, spiritual crisis, and social disorder became even more blurred. There was no clear separation between mind and soul. A troubled person was not seen as someone with a neurological condition, but as someone caught in imbalance, either bodily, spiritual, or moral. This blending of explanation shaped every response. In many towns, the word madness was used broadly. It did not describe one specific condition. It could refer to someone deeply depressed, someone violently unstable, someone intellectually disabled, or someone grieving beyond what society considered normal. Without diagnostic categories, all were grouped together. This lack of distinction often meant that very different struggles received the same treatment. Some medieval physicians began writing more detailed descriptions of unusual behavior. They noted sleeplessness, persistent sadness, paranoia, obsessive fear, and extreme mood swings. These observations were sometimes careful and thoughtful, yet the explanations always returned to humor imbalance or spiritual disruption. A physician might suggest music to calm agitation, storytelling to distract melancholy, or travel to change a person's environment. Though primitive, these suggestions show attempts at psychological relief rather than punishment. Music in particular was believed to soothe the mind. Certain melodies were prescribed to counteract melancholy. Laughter was also considered medicinal. Physicians and clergy alike believed that joy could rebalance the spirit. While not scientifically grounded, these practices hint at intuitive understanding that environment and emotion mattered. However, fear remained strong when behavior became unpredictable. Individuals who shouted incoherently, stripped in public, or claimed divine instruction were sometimes seen as dangerous. In these cases, chains or confinement were used. Early asylums began appearing in parts of Europe by the late medieval period, though they were closer to holding institutions than treatment centers. Their purpose was order, not healing. One of the most complex areas of medieval mental health was the phenomenon of mass hysteria. At times, entire groups displayed unusual behavior, dancing compulsively, claiming visions, or entering trance-like states. Without modern explanation, these events were interpreted as divine intervention or demonic influence. Social stress, famine, plague, and war likely intensified these outbreaks. They reveal how collective anxiety could take physical form in a society already steeped in spiritual interpretation. The Black Death amplified psychological strain to unimaginable levels. Entire families vanished within weeks. Priests died alongside peasants. Order collapsed in many regions. Survivors struggled with fear of sudden death and a sense of divine punishment. Chroniclers described despair so deep that people abandoned hope entirely. Yet there was no concept of trauma counseling. Grief was endured in silence, framed as God's will. Children growing up in this environment absorbed instability early. Sudden death, public executions, and constant religious warning shaped emotional development. Anxiety about sin and damnation was common. Young minds carried fears that modern society would consider overwhelming. Still, these fears were normalized. Everyone lived under them. Despite limitations, medieval communities sometimes offered natural support systems. Extended families lived closely together. Shared labor and shared worship created routine. Routine, even without scientific understanding, provided stability. Isolation was less common than in modern life. This communal structure may have buffered some individuals from total collapse. At the same time, those who could not conform faced exclusion. Beggars, wanderers, and those labeled insane were often pushed to the margins. Society valued order and predictability. Those who disrupted it were controlled or removed. Compassion and cruelty coexisted side by side. Women accused of witchcraft often displayed behaviors that modern observers might interpret as mental illness. Paranoia, hallucinations, or erratic conduct. Fear of the supernatural magnified misunderstanding. Trials for witchcraft sometimes grew from community anxiety projected onto vulnerable individuals. Mental difference could become a death sentence in periods of heightened fear. Monasteries continued to document inner psychological battles with surprising honesty. Writings reveal anxiety about salvation, intrusive thoughts, guilt spirals, and spiritual exhaustion. Though framed religiously, these accounts read like early descriptions of obsessive-compulsive disorder or depression, yet relief was sought through fasting, prayer, and confession rather than medical treatment. By the late medieval period, understanding of the mind had not advanced dramatically, but awareness of emotional complexity had deepened. Scholars wrote about the passions, temperament, and internal conflict. There was curiosity, even if explanation remained limited. Mental health in medieval times was therefore a mixture of misunderstanding and insight. There was no neuroscience, but there was observation. There was no therapy, but there was community. There was fear, but also faith. Suffering existed in every village, every monastery, every battlefield, but it was interpreted through a lens shaped by belief rather than biology, and in that world, the human mind carried its burdens quietly, seeking balance in prayer, in routine, in herbs, in song, and sometimes simply in endurance. As medieval society matured and institutions grew more structured, attitudes toward mental suffering slowly became more organized, though not necessarily more compassionate. By the later Middle Ages, certain cities had begun to establish dedicated spaces for those considered mad. These institutions were often attached to hospitals or religious foundations. One of the most well-known examples would later be known as Bedlam in London, originally founded as a religious house before evolving into a place associated with confinement of the mentally ill. Its early purpose was not cruelty in design, but containment in practice. These institutions reflected a growing belief that madness needed to be separated from daily life. In small villages, unusual behavior could be absorbed into the community. In growing cities, disorder felt more threatening. Trade, governance, and urban life required structure. Those who disrupted it were increasingly removed from public spaces. Confinement was presented as protection for the individual and for society. Inside these early facilities, treatment remained basic. There was little understanding of what caused hallucinations, severe mood swings, or cognitive decline. Some patients were restrained with chains, not always out of malice, but because there were few alternatives for managing violence or self-harm. Care varied widely depending on the institution and the resources available. In some places, patients were fed, clothed, and sheltered with basic dignity. In others, neglect was common. It is important to remember that medieval medicine operated within the limits of its time. Without knowledge of brain chemistry or neurological disease, physicians relied on observation and tradition. Mental illness was still linked to the humors. If someone seemed overly agitated, yellow bile was blamed. If someone withdrew into despair, black bile was suspected. Remedies aimed at rebalancing the body through herbs, diet, and bloodletting persisted well into the later period. At the same time, religious interpretation remained powerful. Pilgrimages were sometimes recommended for those struggling mentally. Families might bring a disturbed relative to a shrine believed to have healing power. The journey itself, long, structured, purposeful, may have offered temporary relief through movement and hope. Healing was expected to come through divine intervention rather than psychological understanding. Interestingly, some medieval writers showed surprising sensitivity to inner experience. Mystics described states of intense emotion that resembled modern anxiety or dissociation. Their accounts reveal awareness of overwhelming fear, intrusive thoughts, and emotional extremes. While interpreted spiritually, these writings demonstrate that medieval people were not unaware of mental complexity. They simply lacked modern vocabulary. The social class of the individual also shaped experience. Wealthier families could hide or privately care for struggling relatives, protecting them from public stigma. Poorer individuals were more exposed to communal judgment. Begging, wandering, and unpredictable behavior were more likely to attract punishment among the poor than among the protected elite. The legal system also intersected with mental health. Courts sometimes had to determine whether a person was sane enough to be responsible for a crime. The concept of non compos mentis, meaning not of sound mind, began to appear in legal language. This recognition did not stem from modern psychology, but it shows early attempts to distinguish between intentional wrongdoing and mental incapacity. However, such distinctions were inconsistent and often influenced by status. Superstition never fully disappeared. Sudden psychological change was sometimes attributed to curses or witchcraft. Community fear could escalate quickly. In times of famine or plague, anxiety intensified suspicion. Vulnerable individuals were at greater risk of being labeled dangerous or unnatural. Despite these limitations, it would be incorrect to imagine medieval society as entirely brutal. Many families cared for distressed members with patience. Religious communities offered routine and stability. Shared belief systems provided meaning during suffering. Even without scientific tools, humans remained capable of empathy. The medieval understanding of mental health was shaped by a worldview in which the invisible world felt immediate and real. Illness was not confined to the body. It existed within a cosmic framework of God, sin, demons, and fate. This worldview gave suffering context, but it also limited solutions. Relief depended on spiritual reconciliation, physical balance, or social containment rather than psychological therapy. By the end of the medieval period, mental health had not yet emerged as a separate field. It remained entangled with religion, medicine, and law. The mind was not studied as an independent organ. It was treated as part of the whole person, body and soul together. And so the medieval experience of mental suffering moved quietly through hospitals, monasteries, villages, and courts, sometimes feared, sometimes misunderstood, sometimes gently endured, always present, always human, even without the language we use today. As the medieval centuries moved toward their later phases, the understanding of mental suffering remained firmly anchored in older traditions. Yet subtle shifts began to appear in how people described inner distress. The language was still spiritual, still framed in terms of sin, temptation, or imbalance, but descriptions grew more detailed. Writers did not have modern psychology, but they had observation. And observation, repeated across generations, slowly deepened awareness of the human mind's fragility. Clergy often encountered emotional turmoil in the confessional. People spoke of intrusive thoughts, overwhelming guilt, fear of eternal punishment, and cycles of despair that would not lift. Some believers became trapped in obsessive concern over whether they had confessed properly, prayed correctly, or committed hidden sins. Today, this might resemble scrupulosity, a form of obsessive-compulsive disorder, but in medieval times it was interpreted as spiritual struggle. The solution offered was more prayer, more confession, more vigilance. For some, this structure provided comfort. For others, it intensified anxiety. Monastic writings from the period show that religious life did not protect individuals from psychological suffering. Monks described long stretches of emotional numbness, boredom so intense it felt like spiritual emptiness, and waves of hopelessness that drained motivation. They called this condition acedia, and it was feared because it threatened faith itself. The prescribed remedies were discipline, physical labor, scripture reading, and community support. Though framed religiously, these remedies resemble attempts to create routine and social connection, tools that modern psychology also recognizes as stabilizing. Outside religious communities, the daily hardships of medieval life weighed heavily on mental well-being. Life expectancy was short, infant mortality was high, disease was common. Famine could arrive without warning. Every family experienced loss repeatedly. Chronic grief became part of ordinary existence. Without therapeutic language, sorrow was absorbed into ritual. Mourning customs, communal prayer, and shared storytelling provided structure to unbearable events. These rituals functioned as collective coping mechanisms, even if they were not designed as such. War left its own invisible scars. Medieval chronicles describe knights and soldiers who returned from battle withdrawn, restless, or prone to sudden anger. These behaviors were rarely described as illness. They were framed as consequences of violence or spiritual burden. Yet the symptoms, nightmares, emotional volatility, hypervigilance, suggest experiences similar to what we now recognize as trauma. There was no treatment beyond confession, pilgrimage, or withdrawal into quieter life. Women's mental health continued to be filtered through assumptions about female nature. Emotional intensity in women was often linked to the womb or to supposed bodily instability. The term hysteria, though developed later, reflects roots in medieval thinking that tied women's emotions to reproductive organs. Postpartum distress, grief after repeated child loss, and anxiety within rigid social roles were rarely understood as conditions deserving care. Instead, they were absorbed into expectations of endurance. At the margins of society, those with severe mental illness often drifted between tolerance and rejection. Some became wandering figures known to villages along established routes. If harmless, they might receive food or shelter. If disruptive, they could be beaten, expelled, or confined. The response depended less on diagnosis and more on behavior. Calm eccentricity could be tolerated. Violence could not. In some cases, people with unusual mental states were reinterpreted positively. Mystics who reported visions, trances, or ecstatic experiences sometimes gained followers. If their behavior aligned with religious expectation, they could be celebrated rather than confined. This duality reveals how interpretation shaped destiny. The same symptoms could lead to sainthood or imprisonment depending on context. The gradual growth of cities toward the end of the medieval period made difference harder to accommodate. Urban life required order. Public disturbance became less tolerable. Institutions expanded slowly to contain those who could not conform. care remained minimal. The primary goal was stability. Yet even within limitation, there were small gestures of humanity. Herbal knowledge passed quietly through generations. Music, storytelling, shared meals, and communal labor provided rhythm and distraction. These were not labeled treatments, but they often served that function. The medieval world lacked psychological science, but it did not lack shared life. What defines mental health in medieval times is not cruelty alone nor compassion alone, but a world attempting to understand invisible suffering with limited tools. The mind was real, but mysterious. Distress was undeniable, but its cause remained debated between body and spirit. Care existed but without clarity, and through it all, medieval people carried fear, grief, anxiety, and hope inside themselves much as we do now, seeking balance in belief, in community, and in the fragile stability of everyday routine. As the later medieval world moved slowly toward the edge of change, attitudes toward mental suffering continued to evolve in subtle and uneven ways. There was still no unified medical field devoted to the mind, yet scattered observations began to accumulate. Physicians, clergy, and scholars were gradually recording patterns rather than isolated events. They noticed that certain individuals fell into recurring cycles of gloom. Others experienced bursts of agitation followed by collapse. Some seemed detached from reality entirely, speaking to unseen presences or withdrawing from social life for long stretches. These patterns did not yet form diagnostic categories, but awareness was deepening. Medical texts from the later Middle Ages began describing melancholy with increasing detail. It was no longer simply sadness caused by black bile. Writers noted that melancholic individuals could experience irrational fear, delusions of persecution, obsessive thoughts, and profound hopelessness. Some even described how the mind could become trapped in one idea, unable to release it. These descriptions, though still rooted in humor theory, show careful observation of mental complexity. Treatment, however, remained bound to traditional methods. Physicians prescribed changes in diet, exposure to sunlight, fresh air, and carefully selected herbs. Gardens attached to monasteries and hospitals cultivated plants believed to calm agitation or lift sadness. While scientific understanding was absent, there was recognition that environment influenced mood. Quiet spaces, structured routine, and moderate physical labor were seen as stabilizing influences. At the same time, society's patience for visible disorder remained limited. Those whose behavior crossed social boundaries, violent outbursts, incoherent speech, public nudity, uncontrollable shouting, were increasingly removed from everyday life. Confinement became more organized as cities expanded. Some early institutions resembled prisons more than hospitals. The focus was not cure, but containment. Legal systems continued grappling with the concept of insanity. Courts occasionally ruled that individuals deemed mentally unsound could not manage property or stand trial in the same way as others. These rulings were inconsistent, but they reflect early recognition that mental state influenced responsibility. Even without psychological science, medieval law acknowledged that not all actions came from rational intent. The role of religion remained central. Spiritual direction provided the closest equivalent to counseling. Confessors advised patience, repentance, and discipline for those suffering anxiety or intrusive thoughts. Pilgrimages were still recommended as spiritual and emotional remedies. The physical act of walking long distances, away from familiar surroundings, may have provided temporary mental relief, even if framed as devotion. Mystical experience continued to complicate interpretation. Some individuals described visions and voices in ways that modern observers might associate with psychosis. Yet if these experiences aligned with accepted doctrine, they could elevate the individual's status rather than diminish it. The boundary between illness and inspiration was fragile. Cultural context determined outcome. Communities themselves functioned as informal support networks. Extended families lived closely together, often sharing labor and daily routine. This proximity reduced isolation. A struggling individual rarely faced suffering alone, though understanding might be limited. Social structure offered containment of a different kind, not through chains but through constant presence. However, this same closeness could magnify fear. If behavior deviated too sharply from expectation, suspicion grew quickly. In times of famine or plague, communities became tense and anxious. Anxiety sought explanation, and individuals displaying unusual mental states could become targets. Accusations of witchcraft sometimes grew from this atmosphere of fear, mixed with misunderstanding. By the very end of the medieval period, the groundwork for future change was quietly forming. Universities expanded study of medicine. Classical texts were revisited. Curiosity about the body and mind grew, even if answers remained incomplete. The idea that mental disturbance might have natural causes rather than purely spiritual ones began to surface more clearly, though it would take centuries to fully develop. What remained constant throughout the Middle Ages was the human experience of inner struggle. Panic attacks occurred without a name. Depression unfolded without diagnosis. Trauma lingered without therapy. Yet people endured. They prayed, worked, sang, traveled, confessed, and rested. They built meaning around suffering because meaning was often the only available medicine. Mental health in medieval times was therefore not absent, but framed differently. It lived inside monasteries and marketplaces, battlefields and kitchens, shrines and courts. It was interpreted through humors and demons, through sin and salvation. It was feared, misunderstood, tolerated, sometimes gently cared for, and often simply endured. And as the medieval world slowly faded into the early modern age, it carried with it centuries of observation, belief, fear, and resilience, leaving behind a complicated legacy of how humans tried to understand the invisible workings of the mind long before science could explain them. As the medieval centuries slowly approached their end, the experience of mental suffering remained woven into daily life in ways both visible and hidden. By this time, patterns of response had become deeply rooted. Society had developed habits, some compassionate, some restrictive, that shaped how individuals lived with inner turmoil. There was still no separate science of psychology, yet the accumulation of lived experience created a kind of informal understanding passed quietly through generations. One of the most consistent realities of medieval mental health was endurance. People were expected to endure hardship without naming it as illness. Life was unstable. Death was common. Crops failed. War returned. Disease never felt far away. Under such conditions, anxiety and grief were not unusual responses, they were normal. What we might now call chronic stress was embedded into existence. The absence of a medical framework did not remove distress, but it normalized it. Spiritual leaders continued to act as primary guides for troubled minds. Confession remained one of the few structured spaces where individuals could speak openly about fear, guilt, or obsessive thought. Though framed in moral language, these conversations sometimes offered relief simply through expression. A troubled person could describe their worries and receive reassurance. In this sense, religious ritual unintentionally functioned as emotional regulation. At the same time, strict religious teaching could intensify mental strain. Constant reminders of sin, divine judgment, and eternal punishment created environments where anxiety flourished. Individuals prone to scrupulosity or obsessive guilt could become trapped in cycles of confession and self-blame. The very system designed to provide comfort sometimes deepened distress. Late medieval medical texts showed growing curiosity about the brain and its connection to behavior. Scholars debated whether the mind resided in the heart or the head. They studied memory, imagination, and reason as faculties of the soul, trying to map internal experience even without physical knowledge of the nervous system. Though limited, these discussions marked early steps toward separating mental function from purely spiritual explanation. Institutions for the mentally ill expanded slowly but remained inconsistent. Some cities developed dedicated spaces where the mad were housed under supervision. Care was rarely therapeutic. Conditions could be harsh. Yet the existence of such institutions suggests recognition that mental disturbance required management beyond punishment. Even if solutions were imperfect, awareness had grown. In rural communities, life remained more personal. A person who struggled mentally was often known by name and history. They were someone's brother, daughter, neighbor. Familiarity sometimes softened response. A quiet man who muttered to himself might be tolerated if he harmed no one. A grieving widow who withdrew from social life might be left in peace. Social bonds, even without scientific understanding, provided a measure of stability. Mass events, plagues, famines, wars, continued to shape collective mental health. Chronic fear of catastrophe left psychological imprints across generations. The constant presence of religious imagery about apocalypse and divine wrath amplified tension. Yet shared belief also offered shared comfort. Communal prayer and ritual provided rhythm in chaos. Toward the very end of the medieval era, intellectual currents began shifting. Renewed interest in classical Greek and Roman texts encouraged more naturalistic explanations of illness. The humoral system remained dominant, but cracks appeared in purely spiritual interpretations. The idea that the body itself could produce mental disturbance gained slightly more ground. This shift was gradual and incomplete, but it marked the beginning of change. What endured most clearly across medieval mental health was humanity itself. Even without psychology, medieval people loved, feared, grieved, hoped, and struggled internally, just as people do now. They interpreted these experiences differently, but the core emotions were the same. Anxiety over survival, sadness over loss, fear of the unknown, longing for peace. The medieval world did not possess therapy, medication, or neurological science. It possessed prayer, ritual, community, herbal knowledge, and endurance. These tools were limited, yet they represented sincere attempts to make sense of invisible suffering. And so mental health in medieval times lived quietly between faith and fear, between community and isolation, between misunderstanding and compassion. never fully explained, yet always deeply felt. As the medieval period continued unfolding across different regions of Europe, mental suffering remained something people encountered regularly, but rarely separated from the rest of life. There was no sharp line dividing emotional distress from physical illness, from spiritual doubt, or from social hardship. Everything blended together. A person weakened by hunger might also become withdrawn. A person grieving repeated loss might begin speaking to themselves. A soldier who survived battle might sit in silence for hours, staring into nothing. None of this was categorized. It was simply life pressing heavily upon the mind. In towns and cities that were growing larger by the 14th and 15th centuries, authorities began paying closer attention to those whose behavior disrupted public order. Urban environments required predictability. Markets had to run smoothly. Streets had to remain safe. As populations increased, tolerance for visible instability decreased. The response was rarely medical. It was administrative. Those who could not control themselves were supervised, confined, or placed under family responsibility. This was less about cruelty and more about maintaining structure. Family responsibility remained central. Medieval households were multi-generational and tightly connected. If someone experienced persistent sadness, agitation, or confusion, relatives absorbed the burden. Care was domestic rather than institutional. Meals were shared. Work was assigned according to ability. Routine created rhythm. While there was no therapeutic model, there was constant presence. Isolation, which worsens many modern conditions, was less common within these living arrangements. At the same time, the cultural interpretation of unusual mental states continued to vary widely. In deeply religious communities, visions or trances could elevate a person's status. If a woman reported seeing saints or angels and her behavior aligned with accepted doctrine, she might attract admiration. If her visions contradicted authority or created social tension, suspicion could follow. The same psychological event could result in honor or punishment depending on context. Interpretation determined fate. Wandering figures known as holy fools, or harmless madmen, sometimes moved between villages. They occupied ambiguous positions within society. Their unpredictability made them unsettling, yet their detachment from ordinary ambitions sometimes granted them a strange respect. People projected meaning onto them. Some were seen as touched by divine mystery. Others were simply tolerated as long as they caused no harm. Medieval society had space, however small, for difference that did not threaten stability. Scholars continued debating the relationship between imagination and reason. Medieval philosophy held that the imagination could overpower rational thought, leading to distorted perceptions. This idea hinted at an understanding that mental processes themselves could malfunction. Though framed philosophically rather than medically, it reflects genuine curiosity about internal mechanisms of thought. Grief remained one of the most widespread and unspoken forms of psychological burden. Plague cycles did not disappear entirely. Famine still struck certain regions. Childbirth carried risk. Loss was woven into existence. Mourning rituals provided structured expression of sorrow. Black clothing, prayer gatherings, and communal remembrance allowed grief to be shared publicly. These rituals may have functioned as collective coping strategies long before psychology identified the importance of communal support. There was also a quiet recognition that solitude could both harm and heal. Monastic life offered controlled isolation. Silence was practiced intentionally. Some individuals found peace in withdrawal from chaotic society. Others struggled deeply with loneliness inside monastery walls. Medieval writings show awareness that too much isolation could lead to despair. Even without modern terminology, they observed the effects. By the late medieval era, Europe stood on the threshold of intellectual change. Universities were expanding. Scholars revisited classical texts that treated mental disturbance as natural imbalance, rather than solely spiritual conflict. This did not immediately revolutionize treatment, but it opened space for questioning old assumptions. The mind was slowly becoming something that could be studied rather than simply judged. Yet throughout this long period, one truth remained constant. The medieval person experienced inner life just as intensely as any modern person. Fear of death, longing for safety, shame, anxiety, grief, love, all unfolded within minds that lacked scientific explanation but not emotional depth. Mental suffering was not absent. It was interpreted through the only lenses available, and so, across monasteries and markets, battlefields and farms, shrines and city gates, the medieval mind carried its invisible burdens forward, seeking balance through prayer, routine, community, and the quiet endurance that defined so much of life in that age. As the medieval world edged closer to the dawn of a new intellectual age, the treatment and understanding of mental suffering remained deeply rooted in tradition, yet subtle currents of change continued moving beneath the surface. Knowledge did not shift quickly. It moved slowly, shaped by centuries of belief. Still, by the 15th century, certain scholars and physicians were beginning to look at human behavior with a slightly more natural curiosity rather than immediate spiritual suspicion. Medical universities in places like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford studied ancient Greek and Roman texts more closely. Physicians revisited the works of Hippocrates and Galen, reinforcing the humoral theory but also encouraging systematic observation. Melancholy became one of the most discussed mental conditions. It was described not just as sadness, but as a state that could distort perception, produce irrational fears, and alter sleep patterns. Some physicians even noted that excessive study or isolation could trigger it, an early recognition that lifestyle influenced mental state. Despite these observations, treatment remained largely unchanged. Diet, controlled bleeding, herbal tonics, and structured daily routines were still prescribed. Physicians might recommend companionship for those who withdrew too deeply into solitude. They might suggest exposure to sunlight, moderate exercise, or music. These prescriptions were not framed as psychological therapy, yet they reveal awareness that environment shaped the mind's condition. Meanwhile, the Church continued to guide spiritual interpretation. Religious confession and counsel provided one of the few safe spaces for discussing internal struggle. Clergy sometimes recognized when distress was not moral failure but overwhelming burden. In such cases, compassion appeared in pastoral advice. Not all responses were harsh. Some were gentle, urging patience rather than punishment. However, fear never fully disappeared. When individuals exhibited extreme behavior, violent mania, incoherent speech, or persistent hallucinations, communities often reverted to suspicion. In times of social tension, the mentally ill could still become scapegoats. Superstition lingered. Witchcraft accusations sometimes grew from misunderstanding combined with anxiety. Urban institutions housing the mad became more formalized as cities grew. Though primitive by modern standards, their existence reflected growing administrative awareness that mental disturbance required structured response. Care varied widely. Some institutions provided food and shelter with minimal cruelty. Others were harsh and restrictive. The goal remained containment rather than cure. What stands out in this late medieval period is the tension between fear and curiosity. On one hand, inherited beliefs about demons and sin persisted. On the other, scholars increasingly framed mental disturbance as natural imbalance within the body. These two explanations coexisted rather than replaced one another. Medieval society did not suddenly abandon spirituality. It layered new ideas over old ones. For ordinary people, daily survival continued shaping emotional life more than theory did. Farmers worried about harvests. Merchants feared economic loss. Families braced for illness. The constant presence of uncertainty created a baseline of anxiety that required resilience. Community bonds, religious ritual, and shared labor remained the strongest stabilizing forces available. By the close of the medieval era, the understanding of mental health had not yet broken free from spiritual and humoral frameworks. Yet seeds of change were planted. The mind was increasingly discussed as something that could be observed and analyzed. Illness was sometimes described as imbalance rather than possession. These shifts were small, but they mattered. The medieval experience of mental health was therefore neither entirely cruel nor enlightened. It was human. It reflected the limits of knowledge and the depth of belief. People suffered in ways we recognize today, but they explained that suffering through the language of their time. And so as Europe slowly prepared to enter a new age of learning and exploration, it carried forward centuries of accumulated attempts to understand the invisible storms of the mind, attempts shaped by faith, tradition, fear, compassion, and endurance. As the medieval centuries stretched toward their final horizon, the experience of mental suffering became more visible not because understanding had dramatically improved, but because society itself had grown more complex. Larger cities, expanding trade networks, shifting political alliances, and repeated waves of disease placed continuous pressure on communities. With pressure came strain, and with strain came more visible signs of emotional and psychological distress. By this stage, the medieval world had accumulated hundreds of years of informal observation. Physicians, monks, judges, and families had all encountered individuals whose minds did not function in ways considered stable. Though they lacked modern terminology, they could recognize patterns. The person who fell into long silence and refused food, the one who paced endlessly, speaking to unseen presences, the widow who wept without pause, the soldier who startled violently at small noises, the scholar who obsessed over a single theological question until sleep vanished entirely. These were not rare cases. They were woven quietly into ordinary life. Medical writings from the late medieval period sometimes attempted more careful classification of melancholy and mania. Melancholy was increasingly described as a disorder of imagination, where the mind misinterpreted reality. Physicians wrote about patients who believed they were made of glass, or that animals were crawling beneath their skin, or that they had committed unforgivable sins. These descriptions are striking because they show close attention to delusion and distorted belief. Yet the explanation always circled back to humoral imbalance. Black bile remained the culprit. Treatment continued to revolve around balancing the body, but physicians also recommended sensory experiences as therapy. Gardens, music, storytelling, baths, and companionship were sometimes prescribed. Fresh air and scenic walks were considered helpful. While framed medically through humors, these suggestions reveal intuitive understanding that isolation worsened mental strain. Even without neuroscience, medieval observers recognized that environment mattered. At the same time, social fear persisted. In times of instability, unusual behavior triggered suspicion quickly. When crops failed or disease returned, communities searched for causes. Individuals who behaved erratically could be blamed for misfortune. Though not every case led to persecution, the risk remained. The mentally ill lived within a fragile tolerance that could shift with public mood. Legal authorities continued refining the concept of mental incapacity. Property disputes sometimes required courts to determine whether an individual was capable of rational decision-making. Guardianship systems developed in some regions to manage the affairs of those deemed not of sound mind. These early legal frameworks suggest awareness that mental functioning influenced responsibility and vulnerability. While imperfect, they mark gradual institutional recognition of cognitive difference. Inside religious communities, introspection deepened. Mystical writings from the 15th century reveal complex descriptions of anxiety, fear of divine abandonment, and overwhelming emotional states. Some mystics described darkness so intense it felt like loss of self. Others wrote of intrusive temptations and despair that persisted for years. Though framed as spiritual trials, these accounts resemble modern descriptions of depressive and anxiety disorders. The difference lay in interpretation, not experience. Grief continued to define emotional life. Generations who survived the Black Death still carried its psychological shadow. Parents lived with constant awareness that children might not survive. Every fever threatened catastrophe. This chronic uncertainty shaped a culture accustomed to anticipatory fear. Anxiety was normalized because the world itself was unstable. Urban institutions housing the mentally ill became slightly more structured, but not yet humane by modern standards. Some facilities provided shelter and basic care. Others relied on confinement and restraint. There was no consistent philosophy guiding them. The goal was still containment rather than healing. Yet even containment reflected recognition that mental suffering required attention rather than execution. It is also important to recognize the resilience embedded in medieval society. Routine labor structured the day. Religious festivals punctuated the year. Storytelling, music, shared meals, and community rituals created emotional rhythm. These collective practices may have served as protective factors against total psychological collapse. Though medieval people lacked therapy, they possessed communal identity. As intellectual currents began shifting toward the Renaissance, curiosity about the human condition slowly expanded. Scholars questioned inherited assumptions. Anatomical studies would soon begin to challenge old medical frameworks. Though the medieval period itself did not fully transform mental health understanding, it laid the groundwork. Observation had accumulated. Contradictions had been noticed. Questions had been asked. What emerges from this long medieval landscape is not a simple narrative of cruelty or ignorance. It is a story of human beings attempting to interpret invisible suffering with the conceptual tools available to them. They did not know about neurotransmitters or trauma responses. They knew about imbalance, sin, fear, and fate. Within that framework, they tried, sometimes clumsily, sometimes compassionately, to respond. Mental health in medieval times existed in tension between explanation and mystery. It was shaped by faith, limited medicine, community structure, and constant exposure to instability. People endured panic without naming it. They survived grief without counseling. They lived with delusion without diagnosis. Yet they continued working, praying, loving, and building societies. And as the medieval world gradually opened into a new age of inquiry, it carried forward centuries of accumulated struggle and observation, leaving behind a complex legacy of how humanity confronted the fragile workings of the mind, long before science could begin to map its depths. As the medieval world continued shifting slowly toward intellectual transformation, the lived experience of mental suffering remained deeply grounded in daily survival. Even as universities expanded and manuscripts circulated more widely, the average person's understanding of inner distress changed very little. Ideas moved slowly across society. Tradition remained stronger than theory. For most people, the mind was still inseparable from the soul and the body, bound together in a fragile unity that could be disturbed by sin, illness, exhaustion, grief, or divine testing. In villages scattered across Europe, mental distress rarely appeared dramatic at first. It showed itself quietly, through insomnia, irritability, loss of appetite, sudden fear, or withdrawal from conversation. These changes were noticed within households long before they reached clergy or physicians. Family members adjusted responsibilities. Work was redistributed. Meals were shared. In tightly connected communities, deviation from normal behavior was visible immediately, but it was also absorbed into the collective rhythm of life. The agricultural calendar itself shaped emotional experience. Planting season demanded energy and hope. Harvest season brought relief or disappointment. Winter introduced confinement, darkness, and long evenings of stillness. Seasonal rhythms likely intensified mood fluctuations, though they were not described as such. Extended winters may have deepened melancholy. Long labor under summer sun may have provided distraction from sorrow. Without scientific terminology, these patterns were simply accepted as part of the human condition. The clergy remained central figures in interpreting emotional turmoil. Sermons addressed despair, temptation, spiritual dryness, and fear of judgment. While these teachings sometimes heightened anxiety, they also provided frameworks for endurance. Suffering was rarely meaningless in medieval theology. It was explained as purification, trial, or divine mystery. For believers, this interpretation offered psychological structure. Meaning does not eliminate pain, but it can make it bearable. At the same time, there were individuals whose behavior moved beyond what theology could comfortably explain. Severe mania, violent outbursts, incoherent speech, or fixed delusions disrupted not only families, but entire communities. These individuals were often described as out of their senses. The phrase itself reveals an intuitive recognition that reason could fracture. Medieval thinkers understood that rational capacity could break down, even if they could not explain why. Some scholars began cautiously discussing the brain as the seat of mental faculties. Though anatomical knowledge was still limited, there was growing interest in how physical injury affected behavior. Observations from battlefields, where head wounds altered personality or memory, may have contributed to this curiosity. The idea that the body itself could shape thought was beginning to emerge more clearly, though it remained secondary to humoral and spiritual explanations. Mental illness also intersected with poverty in complex ways. The poor were more visible in their suffering. They could not retreat behind estate walls. If distress prevented work, survival became uncertain. Begging sometimes became the only option. This visibility increased stigma. Wealthier families could shield afflicted relatives privately, maintaining dignity while managing symptoms quietly. Public festivals and communal rituals played an underappreciated role in emotional regulation. Medieval life was punctuated by feast days, processions, and celebrations that temporarily lifted burdens. Music filled streets. Collective joy provided release. Even in harsh times, structured celebration offered psychological relief. These cultural rhythms may have functioned as informal resilience mechanisms, yet fear never fully loosened its hold. Apocalyptic thinking remained strong in certain periods. Rumors of divine punishment or impending judgment intensified collective anxiety. In times of plague resurgence or political instability, mental distress spread socially. Fear was contagious. Panic moved through crowds faster than understanding. Toward the very end of the medieval era, new currents of humanist thought began shifting attention toward individual experience. Scholars grew interested in personal emotion, inner life, and subjective perspective. This did not immediately revolutionize treatment, but it signaled change. The mind was slowly being viewed not just as a battlefield of spirits and humors, but as a domain worthy of observation in its own right. Still, for the majority of people living in the 15th century, mental suffering remained something endured rather than diagnosed. A person might live an entire life with anxiety, depression, or delusion without ever hearing a name for it. Relief depended on community tolerance, spiritual reassurance, physical routine, and sometimes simple survival instinct. The medieval understanding of mental health, therefore, cannot be reduced to ignorance or cruelty alone. It was shaped by context, a world without modern medicine, but not without compassion, without psychiatry, but not without awareness of pain, without therapy, but not without shared humanity. And so, as Europe stood on the threshold of profound transformation, the medieval mind carried forward centuries of quiet struggle, resilience, fear, faith, and adaptation, still seeking balance between body and soul, between community and solitude, between explanation and mystery. As the final centuries of the medieval world unfolded, the question of the mind's fragility became harder to ignore. Not because society suddenly understood it, but because life itself kept exposing its limits. Repeated waves of plague, political revolts, shifting religious authority, and economic uncertainty pressed continuously on communities. Under such strain, emotional collapse was not rare. It was expected, though not always acknowledged openly. In growing cities, mental disturbance became more visible simply because more people lived close together. Crowded streets made unusual behavior impossible to hide. Someone shouting at unseen figures or wandering aimlessly through marketplaces could not blend into anonymity. Urban authorities increasingly viewed disorder as a threat to stability. Confinement became a practical response, framed as protection for both the individual and the public. Yet within private homes, the story remained quieter. Families developed their own coping systems. A son prone to violent temper might be kept working outdoors. A daughter who withdrew into silence might be assigned repetitive tasks near the hearth. Medieval life was structured around labor, and labor itself served as distraction. Routine gave shape to days that might otherwise dissolve into rumination. Though not conceived as therapy, structured work often grounded the restless mind. Late medieval physicians continued refining descriptions of melancholy. They noted that sufferers sometimes believed impossible things with absolute certainty. Some thought they were dead. Others feared imaginary conspiracies. Physicians wrote about patients who avoided light, who lost interest in food, who felt constant dread without cause. These observations were careful and specific. Even without neuroscience, there was growing awareness that the mind could produce realities of its own. Treatment remained anchored in balancing the body. Diets were adjusted. Spices and herbs were prescribed to warm or cool the humors. Baths were recommended. In some cases, travel was suggested as a way to shift temperament. The idea that environment could influence mood grew slowly stronger. A change of scenery, a pilgrimage, or temporary relocation was believed capable of restoring balance. Religious communities continued offering structured spaces for reflection. Monasteries provided routine silence, prayer schedules, and physical labor. For some individuals overwhelmed by chaos outside, this predictability offered relief. For others, isolation intensified inner voices. Medieval writings show both outcomes. The same environment could calm one mind and disturb another. Superstition persisted alongside growing curiosity. Belief in possession never fully disappeared. Exorcism rituals were still performed when behavior appeared extreme. Yet not every unusual mind was interpreted as demonic. Gradually, natural explanations gained slight ground. The body and soul were still intertwined, but scholars increasingly entertained the idea that bodily imbalance could produce mental disturbance without supernatural cause. Public attitudes remained inconsistent. A harmless eccentric might be tolerated for years. A person whose behavior frightened others could quickly lose protection. Medieval society valued order deeply. Anything threatening communal stability risked removal. This tension between tolerance and control shaped daily life for those suffering mentally. One of the most defining features of late medieval mental health was its silence. There was no public language for anxiety or depression. Suffering was internal, absorbed into prayer, ritual, and work. People rarely described themselves as ill. They described themselves as tested, burdened, tempted, or cursed. Their words reflected their worldview. As intellectual movements prepared to reshape Europe, curiosity about human nature expanded. The human mind began to interest scholars not only as a spiritual vessel, but as an object of study. This shift was gradual and incomplete, but it signaled the beginning of separation between theology and early scientific inquiry. Yet even at the very edge of the medieval age, most individuals lived and died without witnessing significant transformation in mental health care. They endured what they could, feared what they could not explain, and relied on family, faith, and routine to carry them forward. Mental health in medieval times, therefore, was neither fully neglected nor fully understood. It existed in a landscape shaped by limited knowledge and deep belief. People suffered without diagnosis, but not without awareness of pain. They searched for balance within the frameworks available to them, navigating invisible storms with tools built from tradition rather than science. And so the medieval world carried its unseen struggles quietly, generation after generation, long before the language of psychology would attempt to name what they had always felt. As the medieval period approached its final threshold, something subtle but important was beginning to shift in how educated Europeans thought about the human mind. The change was not dramatic, and it did not immediately improve conditions for those suffering mentally. But curiosity was widening. The rediscovery of classical texts and the slow rise of humanist thinking encouraged scholars to look more closely at individual experience rather than relying solely on inherited religious interpretation. Medical writers began revisiting ancient discussions of the brain as the center of sensation and thought. While humoral theory still dominated, there was increasing acknowledgement that the head itself, its structure and injuries, could influence behavior. Observations from warfare, accidents, and disease revealed that damage to the skull sometimes altered personality, memory, or mood. Though explanations remained incomplete, the idea that mental disturbance might originate physically within the body gained quiet strength. Universities became spaces where these ideas circulated. Students studied philosophy, medicine, and theology together, debating how imagination, reason, and emotion interacted. Some scholars proposed that excessive imagination could distort perception, leading to persistent fear or delusion. Others argued that prolonged grief could weaken the body and alter temperament. These discussions did not yet form psychiatry, but they reflected an emerging effort to separate mental suffering from purely spiritual blame. For ordinary people, however, daily life remained unchanged. Anxiety about survival continued shaping emotional reality. Harvest still determined stability. Disease still returned without warning. Political authority remained unstable in many regions. The average villager did not benefit from university debate. Their understanding of mental health remained tied to church teaching, family guidance, and local custom. In urban centers, institutions housing the mentally ill became slightly more organized but still lacked therapeutic purpose. Records show attempts to classify residents, distinguishing between those permanently disturbed and those temporarily unstable. Such categorization hints at growing recognition that mental states could fluctuate rather than remain fixed. Even so, the primary goal remained social order. Within monasteries and convents, introspective writing continued revealing remarkable awareness of internal struggle. Late medieval mystics described emotional darkness, fear of abandonment by God, and periods of overwhelming inner confusion. Their accounts, while spiritual, demonstrate acute sensitivity to psychological states. Some even acknowledge that these experiences could stem from bodily weakness or exhaustion rather than divine punishment. The cultural atmosphere of the late medieval period was marked by both fear and creativity. Art, literature, and drama began exploring human emotion more deeply. Tragic plays and poetic works depicted despair, jealousy, madness, and grief with increasing nuance. This artistic sensitivity suggests that society was beginning to view inner life as worthy of exploration rather than simple condemnation. Yet stigma did not disappear. Those who could not function within expected roles still faced confinement or exclusion. Mental illness remained something to manage rather than cure. Compassion depended heavily on family resources and community tolerance. What becomes clear in this late stage is that medieval mental health existed at a crossroads. On one side stood centuries of religious interpretation and humoral medicine. On the other side stood emerging curiosity about anatomy, environment, and individual psychology. The two perspectives overlapped rather than replaced each other. For the person living through these centuries, the experience of mental suffering remained deeply personal. A farmer waking in the night with unexplained dread did not think of chemical imbalance. He thought of divine testing or unseen forces. A widow unable to leave her bed did not describe depression. She described sorrow or spiritual heaviness. Their language differed from ours, but the emotional reality was familiar. As Europe slowly transitioned toward the Renaissance, the medieval legacy of mental health endured. It left behind centuries of observation, misunderstanding, endurance, and partial insight. It showed that even without modern science, human beings recognized that the mind could falter, fracture, and ache. And so, standing at the edge of a new era, the medieval world carried forward its accumulated attempts to explain the invisible struggles of the mind. Attempts shaped by faith, fear, philosophy, and the simple desire to survive. As Europe stood fully on the edge of transformation, the medieval understanding of the mind did not disappear overnight. It lingered, layered into culture, law, medicine, and daily habit. Even as Renaissance curiosity began to open new pathways of thought, the old explanations continued living in villages, churches, and family homes. Mental suffering was still interpreted through a web of body, soul, environment, and fate. By the late 15th century, more detailed medical writing began to circulate. Physicians described cases of prolonged sadness that did not lift with prayer alone. They noted patterns of agitation that returned in cycles. They recorded instances where patients believed themselves transformed into animals or objects, or were convinced of invisible threats. These observations were not mocked. They were documented carefully. The tone of some writings shifted from moral judgment to clinical description. This subtle change marked a turning point. The mind was slowly becoming something to observe, rather than simply condemn. Anatomical curiosity grew as well. Though dissection was still limited and controversial in some regions, scholars began studying the structure of the human body more systematically. Questions about the brain's role in perception and memory surfaced more frequently. If injury to the head altered speech or temperament, perhaps the mind's disturbances were not purely spiritual. These thoughts did not erase religious interpretation, but they introduced doubt into its exclusivity. Urban life continued intensifying awareness of mental instability. Crowded marketplaces, political upheaval, and rapid social shifts increased tension. People living in cities experienced noise, stress, and exposure to strangers in ways rural populations did not. Under such conditions, mental strain became more visible. Institutions housing the mad expanded slightly, reflecting both recognition and fear. At the same time, cultural expression deepened. Late medieval and early Renaissance art depicted emotional states with striking realism. Pain, anguish, ecstasy, and despair were painted on faces with new intensity. Literature explored madness as a theme, not just as divine punishment but as human tragedy. These creative works suggest society was beginning to view psychological suffering as part of the human condition rather than purely moral failure. Yet for most individuals, life remained structured by endurance. Anxiety about death never fully faded. Memories of plague lingered. Religious warnings about judgment persisted. The mind lived in constant awareness of vulnerability. This background hum of insecurity shaped emotional life profoundly. What modern psychology might call chronic stress was simply existence. Family remained the primary support system. Those with mild mental disturbances often stayed integrated into household life. Responsibilities were adjusted quietly. Community tolerance determined quality of life. Harmless difference could be absorbed. Dangerous unpredictability could not. The boundary between these states was defined by behavior rather than diagnosis. The concept of responsibility also continued evolving. Legal documents increasingly recognized the idea that some individuals were incapable of managing their own affairs due to mental weakness. Guardianship arrangements became more formal in certain regions. This reflected growing acknowledgement that mental incapacity affected autonomy. Though limited, it represented movement toward differentiated understanding. Spiritual life did not vanish from explanations. Even as natural philosophy advanced, belief in divine testing, temptation, and possession remained influential. The medieval worldview did not collapse with intellectual progress. It blended old and new ideas together. A physician might prescribe herbs while a priest recommended prayer. Neither saw contradiction. As the medieval era finally yielded to the early modern world, it left behind a complex legacy regarding mental health. It demonstrated that humans have always noticed patterns of sadness, fear, delusion, and despair. It showed attempts, sometimes compassionate, sometimes fearful, to respond within available knowledge. It revealed the power of community routine, ritual, and shared belief in sustaining fragile minds. The Middle Ages did not invent psychological science, but they did leave a record of inner struggle. They preserved descriptions of melancholy, mania, grief, obsession, and trauma. They documented the tension between body and soul, between reason and imagination. These records would later inform thinkers who sought more precise explanations. And so, as the medieval chapter closed and new ideas about anatomy, observation, and humanism prepared to expand understanding further, the lived experience of mental suffering carried forward, unchanged in its intensity, but gradually opening to different interpretations. As the medieval world slowly merged into the early modern age, the way people lived with mental suffering did not change in sudden leaps. It shifted gradually, almost quietly, as new ideas layered themselves over centuries of inherited belief. Old explanations did not vanish. They softened at the edges. A person might still be described as melancholic because of black bile, but there was increasing awareness that prolonged grief, exhaustion, or shock could produce similar symptoms. The vocabulary remained ancient, yet observation became sharper. In towns that were expanding through trade and political centralization, social pressure intensified. Economic instability, rising prices, and shifting authority structures created fresh anxieties. Guild members worried about competition. Farmers worried about taxation. Soldiers faced ongoing conflict in border regions. This constant uncertainty meant that emotional strain was not limited to the visibly disturbed. It spread across society, shaping daily mood and behavior. Yet because anxiety was so common, it rarely stood out as illness. It was woven into the atmosphere. Medical practitioners at this stage paid closer attention to sleep patterns. Insomnia was recognized as both symptom and cause of distress. Physicians noted that individuals deprived of sleep often developed agitation, paranoia, or melancholy. Treatments included herbal sedatives, warm baths, and controlled diets. Though framed within humoral logic, these remedies suggest growing attention to physical states affecting the mind. There was also more discussion about imagination as a powerful internal force. Scholars argued that excessive rumination could distort perception. If a person focused too intensely on fear or guilt, the imagination could transform thought into lived experience. This concept reflects an early understanding of cognitive patterns, even if expressed philosophically rather than clinically. The mind, they realized, could shape its own suffering. Among the educated elite, reading and solitary study sometimes produced anxiety and melancholy. Writers describe scholars overwhelmed by intellectual pressure, trapped in cycles of doubt. The idea that mental distress could arise from mental labor itself marked a subtle shift away from purely moral explanations. The brain was not only a spiritual battlefield, it was an organ capable of fatigue. Meanwhile, for the majority of people, daily labor continued acting as an anchor. Farming, craft work, domestic chores, these tasks structured time and provided distraction from internal turmoil. Routine, though not labeled therapeutic, offered stability. A person who kept moving often avoided spiraling too deeply into despair. Medieval society, built on shared labor, unintentionally created protective rhythms. Yet darker responses remained present. Severe cases of mania or psychosis still led to confinement. Institutional care had not fundamentally changed. Those considered dangerous were isolated, sometimes harshly. The concept of cure had not fully emerged. The primary goal was protection and order. Compassion existed unevenly depending on region, resources, and individual temperament. Cultural expression continued reflecting inner life more vividly. Literature portrayed madness not only as divine punishment, but as tragic human experience. Characters in plays and poems exhibited jealousy, obsession, grief-driven breakdown, and emotional fragmentation. Art captured faces etched with despair. These representations suggest society was increasingly willing to look directly at psychological pain rather than hide it entirely behind superstition. Spiritual guidance remained deeply influential. Confessors and spiritual directors often counseled those struggling with despair, urging balance between self-discipline and mercy. Some clergy recognized that relentless guilt harmed the soul. In these moments, compassion softened rigid doctrine. The line between spiritual counsel and psychological support blurred gently. What becomes clear in this extended medieval journey is that mental health was never absent. It was interpreted, filtered, and managed through available knowledge. People recognized suffering. They recognized when minds fractured under pressure. They sought remedies in prayer, herbs, music, pilgrimage, labor, companionship, and sometimes isolation. The medieval understanding did not resolve these struggles scientifically, but it did document them. It left behind manuscripts filled with descriptions of fear, sorrow, confusion, ecstasy, and despair. These records form a bridge between worlds. a testament that long before psychology emerged as a field, humanity was already grappling with the invisible architecture of thought and emotion. And so, as the old medieval structures slowly gave way to Renaissance inquiry and the first hints of anatomical investigation, the mind remained what it had always been: fragile, resilient, mysterious, and deeply human, carrying its unseen burdens across centuries without ever fully losing its capacity to endure. As the medieval world slowly dissolved into the early modern age, the long story of mental suffering did not end, nor did it suddenly transform. Instead, it flowed forward, carrying with it centuries of observation, misunderstanding, endurance, and quiet resilience. The Middle Ages did not leave behind a science of the mind, but they did leave behind something equally important: a record of how human beings struggled to interpret the invisible storms within themselves. For 1,000 years, mental distress had been explained through humors, through sin, through divine testing, through imbalance of body and soul. These explanations shaped treatment, shaped fear, and shaped compassion. They led to prayer and pilgrimage, to herbs and bloodletting, to confinement and sometimes cruelty. Yet within those same centuries, they also led to community care, shared mourning rituals, music, routine labor, and structured spiritual counsel. Medieval people did not possess neuroscience, but they possessed awareness. They recognized when the mind faltered. They simply lacked the language to separate biology from belief. What stands out most across this long landscape is endurance. The medieval person lived inside constant uncertainty: plague, famine, war, early death, rigid hierarchy, and spiritual anxiety. Under such weight, mental strain was unavoidable. Panic, melancholy, grief, obsession, and delusion appeared again and again in chronicles, sermons, medical texts, and personal writings. The words differed from ours, but the emotions were the same. As Renaissance curiosity began shifting attention toward anatomy and observation, seeds of change were planted. Scholars slowly questioned whether mental disturbance might originate within the body rather than from external spirits alone. This shift did not erase religion's influence, but it widened perspective. The mind was beginning to be seen as something that could be studied rather than simply judged. Yet the medieval legacy remained powerful. For generations afterward, echoes of humoral theory and spiritual interpretation continued shaping attitudes toward mental health. The Middle Ages became a foundation, imperfect, incomplete, but formative. They demonstrated that humans have always tried to understand suffering even when tools were limited. And so when we look back at mental health in medieval times, we do not see a world without awareness. We see a world explaining the mind through the only frameworks it possessed. We see compassion mixed with fear, curiosity mixed with superstition, control mixed with care. Above all, we see people trying to survive the invisible battles within themselves while navigating a fragile and uncertain world. As the medieval night gradually fades and a new era of inquiry rises, the story of the mind continues. No longer confined solely to sin or humors, but slowly opening to investigation, reflection, and deeper understanding. And here, at the quiet edge of that transition, the medieval chapter gently closes, leaving behind not silence, but the enduring truth that the human mind has always carried both mystery and meaning, long before science found words to describe it.